Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Green. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. There's been a little snafu. The food was promised it was on its way at quarter after, and it's still not here, so hopefully they didn't go to Cambridge, England. So we're going to get started anyway, and then once the food comes, maybe we'll take a quick break. You guys can load up, and then we'll keep going. So I want to introduce Scott and Nikki. Scott is the Director of the my brain's just completely stopped. Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where I worked until 8 months ago, so it's funny that I botched the name. But he's a former elected DA, and he spends most of his time going in and helping local prosecutors when they catch a case, if they need assistance or prodding. He's good at both of those. And Nikki is a career prosecutor in Queens County who is just become the first inaugural chief of the first ever animal crimes? Animal Cruelty Prosecutions Unit, which literally just started last month in January, so it's brand new. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to them, and thanks a lot for coming.
All right. Can you guys hear this? Is it picking up? I think it's mostly for the recording, but if you can't hear, let me know. Thanks, Chris, for the nice introduction. This is Toby. Toby is an office dog that we lost a couple years ago, but I still like to keep Toby in my PowerPoints because I love Toby. Our email addresses are in here somewhere. I'll get them to you shortly. Why is it going backwards? There we go. Just a little bit more background. I used to be in the trenches as an elected DA. I've been prosecuting, and I've been a lawyer for almost 30 years. And we were just talking about this before we started about I'm old enough to remember when domestic violence wasn't a priority, and cops used to say domestic violence was a family thing, and it's not a law enforcement thing. And I've watched that change occur over the last 28 years. And Nikki and I are seeing sort of that same evolution now as it relates to animal cruelty cases as the older, more entrenched, perhaps less enlightened people who don't value this work start to retire out, or in some cases actually change their minds and shift policy. So we're in the midst of a pretty exciting time as it relates to animal law, especially as applied to the criminal practice, criminal prosecution. So just for the how many here are affiliated with the AlDF? Just show of hands. All right, so just a few of you guys. The Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter here at Harvard, they're all over the country. And of course, Animal Legal Defense Fund is the umbrella organization. That's my current employer. 501c3, been around forever. Chris worked there for a couple of 3 years with us. Nikki's affiliated with us. We're claiming Nikki. She's on contract with us as well. Plus, she's obviously in the Queens County DA's office. And our mission statement is there. I have a pretty cool job in light of what I've been doing for the last 20 years before I joined AlDF. And so when I talk to lawyers, I talk to prosecutors, I like to put that slide up there and remind them that we're the only attorneys who have truly innocent clients. At AlDF, we have 4 kind of key programmatic areas. We have an animal law program that facilitates the relationship with the law schools. We have a civil litigation unit that gets a lot of time and attention in the press with the lawsuits they're filing. We have a legislative program that Chris used to run, and then our criminal justice program that I run right now. And you don't see much from us in the press, and the reason for that is pretty simple. They're not our cases. So we go in and we help law enforcement. We help them write a search warrant, and we help out on a trial or whatever, motion practice. We let that DA's office handle the messaging on the case. So we're not necessarily out raising awareness from an aggressive marketing standpoint, but the DAs will do it for us once the case is closed. We have a great group of lawyers in the office, including, like I said, I'm claiming Nikki. Jill Deegan's also a seated prosecutor out of Virginia that's on contract with us. And then, of course, Virginia Coleman, who's a Harvard alum who lives just a couple, 6 blocks from the law school here. And Balkan and Dunn, you guys will meet them tomorrow if you come to the moot court. That's our home office in Portland. We're on the 4th floor. And I'm from Portland, Oregon. How many people here, I know you're all Harvard-educated brainiacs, so you probably don't watch TV and are going to deny it publicly if you do. Do you ever see Portlandia on? OK. So just for sport, I'm from Portland. We have a bumper sticker like Austin, Texas that says, "Keep Portland Weird." And so we have a TV show dedicated to us. And so when I tell people I'm from Portland, Oregon, and I do animal law.
Who puts a dog outside?
That belong to somebody?
You got to ask around. Hey, excuse me.
Is that your dog?
Sir, is that your dog right there? OK.
Hey, guys.
We're looking for a dog owner.
Looks like a white and brown dog. For real, we got an owner on the dog? Huh? There's an animal tied up to a piece of metal. I'm sure it wasn't born there. Really sorry for what you're going through.
Okay,
Come on,
please,
thank
set
you.
it down. Set it
Set
down immediately.
Set it down.
Immediately. Come here.
You know what? He doesn't like it. Take it away.
This smells metallic
Take it away.
to me.
No, we don't want
no,
the water or
please.
anything.
Dave, I'm freaking out.
Okay.
I'm freaking out,
Calm
Dave.
down, calm down,
Yeah.
calm down, calm down. You know what we're gonna do? We're gonna let him go.
Let it go, please.
You're gonna have all kinds of experiences and meet all kinds of dogs. There's some good paths out there. There's one path that goes right up the hillside. It's so pretty you won't even believe it. And when you're thirsty, you can drink from any lake you want. Imagine the biggest lake in the whole world.
The ocean.
You can just drink the whole thing.
You're free. Run it out, buddy. You're free, soldier.
Where's Tucker?
I don't know, sweetie. Hi, did you happen to see a dog?
We did see a dog, actually.
You did? Okay, did you see where he went?
He went that way. We had to let him go.
Is this some kind of a joke, or?
No. Who puts their dog on a pole like a stripper?
Who does that?
Everybody puts their... Wait a minute, who are you people? We were just gone for a few minutes. Okay, how...
Well, a few minutes is like a month in dog years.
We went to get a cookie,
You
and...
took your dog off the pole because it was choking. No, get out of my face.
It wasn't in your face.
Get out of her face,
Wasn't...
man.
She was in... Look, hey, where are you going?
Did the right thing.
No,
Okay.
we totally did the
Everywhere
right
we
thing.
I'm calling the cops.
I was so tired of you.
Do with
Hi,
animals,
Jordan.
living
No,
things.
Jordan. Quiet down. It's ridiculous.
I'm not crying.
It's a long way to go to get to the punchline, but I think it's worth the wait. So yeah, that's kind of one of those public perceptions we're trying to help people not have about what we do, but nevertheless, that's just for fun. So my job on a daily basis is to, yeah, Walmart. Chris likes the Walmart greeter slide of all the slides, is to help prosecutors and law enforcement with animal cruelty cases. And I spend a fair amount of time just trying to earn the trust of these guys because they don't know us from Adam. They oftentimes are really suspicious of it. When I was DA, when I was the elected DA, nobody ever called me up and said, hey, we're interested in your caseload, can we help you? And that's what, in essence, what we're doing now. And it takes a while, unless you've worked with an office in the past, it takes a while to build up that trust and that relationship. One way we do that is on the front end of a case. This is a cover letter from a case we helped out on a few years back. In Josephine County, Oregon, the DA's office and the sheriff's office had a hoarding case where the defendant had horses, dogs, goats, birds, just over 100 animals. They're all woefully neglected. The sheriff, the elected sheriff, had just lost a levy and had to lay off detectives, lay off about a third of his staff. He calls me up and says, we've got a hoarding case, we want to work it. I don't have anybody to pay. I don't have anybody we can apply to this case. Can you help us out? So we wrote him a check. He went back and hired one of his top detectives that he laid off. The detective went and worked the case, interviewed the defendant, seized the animals, got a conviction, and yay for the team until she reoffended. In hoarding cases, the recidivism rate's close to 100%. She reoffended a year and a half later. But the good news is they worked the case, and they came to us for the funding to do it. So we write a lot of checks. We also offer rewards in cases to help people come forward, and it also helps legitimize us in the eyes of law enforcement as being real, rational people. This is an actual case from New York State where a guy set a cat on fire. We offered up the reward, and this is the one case. We do probably 1 or 2 rewards a month, maybe 12 to 20 a year. And this is the one case where we paid out. People from the community came forward, coughed up the suspect. He was ultimately prosecuted and convicted, and we ended up writing that check. And it was a fun check for us to be writing. We help law enforcement. A lot of times cops have never written a search warrant. Street cops have never written a search warrant ever in their lives. And when the cops that are detectives that do write warrants for drug cases or what have you have never done anything regarding search warrants for animals, and they are different. There's a lot of pseudo-civil stuff that comes up regarding pre-conviction forfeiture, impounding versus seizing as evidence, costs of care. What do you do with the live animals? What do you do about subsequent testing? And I'll talk about that in a second. So we spend a fair amount of time educating and helping write warrants. In hoarding cases, a lot of times law enforcement won't even touch or want to touch a hoarding case because they got to feed the evidence once they seize it. And here's a case from Montana, the Leachman case, where a defendant left over 200 horses up in the snow-covered hills with no feed. They're going to starve to death. And so we got in touch with a donor and wrote a check for 20 grand, and they were literally flying bales of hay in or alfalfa in with helicopters to save these horses. And cops just don't believe that you're willing to do that. They're like, oh, sure, you're going to write a check for us. 20 grand? Sure, we'll believe it when we see it. And so it was pretty cool to see that case come to fruition. And of course, we do a ton of legal research. I get calls from prosecutors especially newbies, 2-3 years out of law school. I'm in the middle of trial. I'm on a recess. Can you help me with this issue? And I love those. Those are fun for me. And a lot of times, sometimes I'm actually able to help. Another issue regarding trial prep, expert witnesses. Most of the time, the state doesn't have any money to hire an expert witness. The state system that's set up for abuse, child abuse, domestic violence, homicides, there's no real resource for animal cruelty. There are no animal cruelty experts necessarily. Even the state vet's offices sometimes are reluctant to get involved. So we'll pay for expert witnesses and fly them out and have them testify. That's only happened a few times. Almost every time the state secures an expert, notices that up to the defense, the defendant ends up pleading because the defense lawyer is like, holy crap, these guys are serious. Oh, sorry. There's a fair amount of work. Everybody's into DNA right now with good reason. It's good science. It's conclusive evidence. And so there's a lot of issues that are developing regarding the admissibility and the population genetics behind, or the population statistics behind animal DNA for a specific species. And so we do a fair amount of work on the science behind that and the admissibility of animal DNA, plus the labs finding people, finding prosecutors and DAs or police officers, labs that'll do the work for them. There's also a DNA lab regarding dog fighting cases, and the reason this is relevant is dogs in fighting cases have two types of value. They have the in the pit value for how much money they're going to win in the fight for that given night. But after they win 5 fights and they become a grand champion, then their stud fees or their puppy fees become, that's where the owners make the real money. And establishing a database of known grand champion or known fighting dogs and then genetically linking puppies that are born by breeders who are claiming to be just weight or strength training rather than fighting dogs, linking those animals up to this known database of established fighters is highly relevant evidence that is good circumstantial evidence to show that these guys had the intent to fight. And so the Canine CODIS project at UC Davis is a big deal that we fund. And then there's the routine forensics with necropsies. So many times, Nikki and I were just talking about this, so many times the old school cops would roll up on an animal cruelty case, a neglect case. The guy's got a dog, dead, he's burying it, and the cop would just throw the body away instead of doing a necropsy. You know, and I get laughed at when I train cops on this, but if I tell police officers, if you handle an animal cruelty case like you would a homicide case or a major assault case, you run the exact same protocol, you will win every case. That's what you need to do in these investigations. And they're sitting there dumbfounded. Are you kidding? It's only a misdemeanor. Who cares? Do it right. Another big issue is jury selection. A lot of times, again, the new prosecutors are calling us up saying, how do I pick a jury in a hoarding case? Because I'm worried about the sympathy factor. This woman's 45 years old, 50 years old, 300 cats, and people are going to feel sorry for her. So we hooked up with Rich Matthews. He's a jury consultant. And just this last fall in Chicago, we brought in, for 3 days, we brought in mock trials. And we did mock trials on hoarding, domestic violence-inspired animal cruelty, and then fighting. And we did all the science on that. And they're crunching the numbers. And we're going to get back profiles on jurors that you want and jurors that you want to look for to maybe excuse for cause. We act as counsel of record. I've sworn in pro hoc in several states besides where I'm admitted to help try cases. And it's quite a bit of fun, actually. I'll tell you what, trying a case in Texas is a hell of a lot different than trying a case in Oregon, where I practice. And I won't say which way. Despite what I do and despite all the other programs we have at AlDF, legislation, in my humble opinion, is where we're going to win this thing. Changing the statutes is paramount to getting good results. When I was the elected DA in Oregon, we had a rodeo come to town at the fairgrounds. And some nice young kids from a national nonprofit came in and said, we want you to prosecute this rodeo. You need to prosecute this rodeo. It's cruel. And God bless you kids. I'm looking at them, looking right in the eyes. God bless you guys. I agree with you. It's cruel. But here's the code. And rodeos are specifically exempted from the statute. I can't do a goddamn thing about this. We've got to change the law. And that's still the case, procedurally and substantively. If we can change the laws, then we've got cases to work, especially if you want to talk about farmed animals and agriculture. We do a ton of trainings. I've been talking about that. We do a lot of work at the appellate level on search and seizure, Fourth Amendment stuff, and also pseudo-victims' rights issues as well. And I'll talk about that in a second. But in the Duncan case out of Massachusetts, the great state of Massachusetts, right here, we got the Supreme Judicial Court, not we, the state, but we came in as amicus on a great, brilliant brief written by Virginia Coleman on the notion of emergency aid and exigent circumstances to allow the admissibility of evidence in a neglect case where these 3 dogs were freezing to death in the cold. cold Massachusetts winter. So big win there. The Fifth Circuit, do you guys all know what crush videos are? Have you heard of crush videos? Nodding, some no, some yeah. All right, without getting too graphic, there's this weird sexual fetish out there where people get off on seeing women with, scantily clad women with high heels, spiky high heels, killing animals with their feet. And they videotape it, and they sell that stuff on the internet. So obviously, the conduct of killing those animals is criminal in every state, no problem. If you catch them in the act, you've got a case. But what do you do with the people that are making a market in this stuff and that are just selling the videotapes or selling the video off the internet? Well, the feds came in and passed this federal statute that made the transactional world of crush videos a federal crime. And the first case that came up to the US Supreme Court, that the statute was stricken as facially invalid First Amendment problems. And it wasn't, the movement tried to characterize animal cruelty as a specially justifiable interest under the First Amendment, and a new exception kind of akin to obscenity or fighting words. And the Supreme Court wouldn't bite. Kicked it back down, passed a new statute federally, and basically crush videos are now deemed obscene. And these two defendants out of Texas, out of Houston, were prosecuted in the Fifth Circuit. The trial court ruled facially invalid statute again, took it up on appeal, Fifth Circuit reversed and held the statute constitutional. The female in that photograph pled out and cooperated. The defendant was just tried and sentenced to 40 years last week. So we're making some good progress at the federal level on crush videos. This is Nikki's case. This is how we met.
I'm just going to jump in for a second and attest to the great work that AlDF did on an appeal that I had in the New York Court of Appeals, which is New York's highest court. I took this case as the deputy chief of appeals at that time. I was assigning all of the cases. I'd never seen an animal cruelty case, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about what are the reasons for that. But our statute was getting reviewed for the first time ever, and it had been enacted in 1825. And so I thought I had a long haul. I had some people in my office who made fun of me and called it my little doggy case, and it was a misdemeanor, and they thought it was a little bit of a waste of time for me to be involved in it, but I thought differently. And as soon as I started to think about it, I thought, well, it's the Court of Appeals. We really need to think about policy, because those are the considerations that the High Court will talk about, and to think about, what are these animal cases like? What should we be advocating for? What are activists? What are welfareists, animal welfareists advocating for? So I started to get involved in thinking about this stuff. I took a webinar and was immediately recommended to AlDF, among other groups, Humane Society, the ASPCA, and AlDF was literally there on a dime. Laura Dunn, who's not here today, but she'll be here tomorrow, jumped on it and worked with me on my main brief as well as an amicus brief. And they did file an amicus in that case that was extremely sophisticated, extremely helpful, both to myself, the prosecution, as well as the Court of Appeals. And the case turned out to be a rather big case, not a little doggy case. On the other side, Pro Bono was a very large New York firm. They had taken the case, forgot, I don't know why. After the case was over, one of the attorneys, among the army of attorneys that they had, said if it had been a cat case, they wouldn't have been able to do it because they like cats. So that was a little strange, but okay. But two criminal defense organizations also wrote amicus briefs. So it turned into doing quite a big case, hundreds and hundreds of pages of briefing, which AlDF helped me with. Laura Dunn, Virginia Coleman also worked on the case. And not only did they do the amicus, help me with my main brief, but they also participated in my moot via teleconference. And that was also very helpful to prepare me to go up and orally argue this case, which ultimately we were victorious in. And that kind of changed the way that I thought about things and the way I thought about these kinds of cases and how important they are to prosecution, to law enforcement, to the safety and welfare of all of our communities. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the facts of that case and what happened there. But it was a rather complicated issue because our statute, the issue in the case was there a mens rea? Was there any kind of mens rea involved in the statute? The statute didn't have one. one. And our position was there was no mens rea, and so we didn't have to prove it, and then the jury didn't have to be instructed on it. And so as a crime of strict liability, the courts are not very favorable when it comes to crimes of strict liability. So it was a kind of a long haul. We had actually won in the intermediate appellate court, and that court agreed with us that there was no mens rea required to be proved, and that it was a crime of strict liability. It was the misdemeanor statute. Our felony statute does have a mens rea, and it's an intentional mens rea, so that's a little bit different. The defense in that case was justification. The defendant claimed he was justified because he didn't have any money, so he didn't feed his dog because he had no money. And Laura Dunn and Virginia Coleman did a fantastic job on that brief, and we were victorious, and it changed the course of events for me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. The other thing that I found out was very, very interesting, and maybe some of you know this, and maybe some of you don't. Lawyers are highly competitive people, and they don't really help each other. I was shocked at the amount of help, and it was unconditional, and it was given freely. It was sophisticated. It really helped me develop my arguments. And I had never experienced that before with other lawyers, particularly from other organizations. So that was a very eye-opening experience for me, and that has held true now that I've been doing these cases ever since. People help you. There's collaboration. You almost can't do it without collaboration of various groups, other prosecutors, other law enforcement agencies that are doing these kinds of cases. And that was quite a breath of fresh air for me after being a lawyer for, I hate to tell you, a lot of years.
Okay, all right. Yeah, no, the Basil case was, that's how we met Nikki and fell in love with her and recognized her great work. A little bit more about what we do in the context of common issues. So the biggest problem we have with animal cruelty is under enforcement. Police officers saying, I don't care about this stuff. I want to go do the sexy fun stuff. I want to do a drug bust. I want to kick in doors and be on TV and all that. And so you win these arguments, on the merits of the sentiency and the suffering of animals with many people, but on others, they're unpersuaded by that rationale, and you have to come at them from a perspective of prevention, right? People who engage in animal cruelty are 5 times more likely to engage in other crimes of violence. There are tons of studies on the link, it's called. And if that doesn't work, then you sue their asses. And when I say sue their asses, I'm talking about animal control, humane societies, and ASPCAs. They all have, some states give them law enforcement authority, at least in that limited capacity as it relates to animal cruelty cases. And if they are not responsive to what the statutes are saying in their state, then a great statutory remedy is to enact a law very much like we did with domestic violence back in the 70s and 80s, enact a statute that requires law enforcement to make an arrest when they have probable cause to believe that a crime of domestic violence in the 70s, animal cruelty in the 2010s, has been committed. And a number of states have gone ahead and actually done that, including Oregon, Nebraska, Michigan, New York, kind of, sort of, Rhode Island, and then there's a duty to investigate in Wisconsin or in West Virginia. So this is highly effective stuff, because if a police officer refuses to follow the statutory edict and make an arrest, a citizen from that jurisdiction has standing to sue them in mandamus, right, and force them to do a non-discretionary statutory duty. And that will change the culture in a law enforcement environment like that. Getting sued one time for breaching state law, and you win. You win every time. And sometimes just all you have to do is write the demand letter. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe we should stop and grab some chow.
Let's go another 5 minutes.
OK. It smells really good. So we talked about throwing out the bodies. The shoddy, another problem with animal cruelty cases, aside from the lack of enforcement, the shoddy investigations. No matter how good of a prosecutor you are in the trial courts, Niki's a phenomenal prosecutor. I spent my time in the trenches. You can be really good and know the law, and you cannot win a case if the evidence isn't admissible, or you don't have the evidence, or if the police didn't turn every stone. Jurors have the expectation that you need to try, and you are in a much better position as a prosecutor and as a law enforcement officer to have tried to find something and not find it than not to have looked, because that's reasonable doubt. If you didn't look, you didn't bother to try, the jury's going to punish you for that every time. So teaching cops to turn every stone, necropsy everybody, work the case as if it were a homicide, you'll be in good shape. Here's that point. Treat each case like it's a homicide or major assault. Preserve the bodies. Consult with a vet in every case. It is malpractice to do an animal cruelty case without talking to a vet, in much the same way it's malpractice to do a child abuse case without talking to a pediatrician. It just is. And yet, so many times we see these cases going through the system on a police officer's site and no follow-up, and these cases are getting lost. Not knowing what you're looking for as an investigator. A lot of cops walk into a drug, they're kicking the door on a drug search warrant, and they see this. I'll give you a close-up of it. They see this fishing tackle box on the floor, and just, oh, it's a fishing tackle box. That's kind of weird. Whatever, walk on. Well, that's actually a suture kit and a bunch of other medical supplies for a dogfighting ring. And officers that aren't trained in that are going to be like, well, that's kind of weird, but I don't see any heroin, and there's some syringes in there, but they're packaged. So, what's that? Well, dogfighting is actually an endurance, and forgive me for the word, endurance sport, right? So to train a dog to fight for an hour and a half in a ring or longer, you put them on slat mills or treadmills. And if you look closely at this, you can see, does this have a pointer? Yeah, see that? There's a clip right there. You put a dog on a harness, you clip him in, you put a cat in a cage at the end here, you run him for 2 hours on the slat mill, and then you let the cat out of the cage, you let the dog kill the cat as a reward. Presto, you've got a dog that's been trained in part. And trained for fighting. Cops don't know what that is unless they've been taught. Gathering evidence, fundamental tenet of criminal law, get evidence that is admissible. And they oftentimes will do their cases without applying for search warrants, relying on exceptions to the warrant requirement. And then you're in the posture of litigating, like we did in Duncan and other cases, the admissibility down the road. There is a huge procedural advantage to the prosecution, to the state, in search warrant cases. Anybody know what they are? Everybody's like, I want food. Just stop talking. The search is, first of all, it's presumed to be valid. And in the criminal justice system, that's kind of cool because it shifts the burden. As a prosecutor, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all the elements of the crime. When the defense wants to exclude evidence that's been seized under a warrant, they have to come into court and prove that the warrant is invalid. And as a prosecutor, we think that's kind of fun, because the defense lawyers have a hard time with proving stuff. They like to tear shit down, but they can't prove anything usually. So, of course, I joke. There are good defense lawyers out there. They do good work. You can also invoke the good faith exception to the exclusionary rule in most jurisdictions. And then this is a big one. The community feedback on animal cruelty cases is through the roof. It's the most shared content on the internet. It's a big deal. And so the news media is obviously picking up on this. And so the defense will try their case in the media, and you'll be hearing defense lawyers talk about how crappy your case is as a prosecutor. And as prosecutors, we answer to a higher calling. You don't try your case in the press. There are specific rules of professional conduct that limit a prosecutor's ability to comment on a pending case. So you're kind of hamstrung. But good reporters know to go to the courthouse, look at the court's file, pull up the search warrant affidavit, take a look at the return. So doing a search warrant, a good affidavit, and then your return of service with a narrative and some photographs, you're in business with a PR. Because then you shut the defense down, and the content, the actual content is in the public domain without an ethics beef. Bad search warrant writing. It's a huge problem. Even if you do get cops that are willing to do search warrants, oftentimes they're written poorly. And some of the unique issues that come up in animal cruelty cases is forgetting to deal with the live-born offspring after you seize all the animals. You go out and seize 100 dogs. 2 weeks later, you've got 115 dogs. Whose animals are they? Are they evidence? So you can deal with that sort of stuff on the front end by writing a quality affidavit that advises the court about that issue up front, and then the court enters an ex parte ruling in your favor regarding what those animals, the status of those animals, and you're in much better shape. What about, in a hoarding case, you've got a population of animals. Say you got 100 dogs, and it's a starvation hoarding case. 100 of those dogs, 10 or 15 of them are going to be doing OK. Oh, geez, sorry. How you guys doing? You want to quit? Yeah, all right, we'll stop and talk more in a few minutes. Grab in. So we're going to get back going. A couple of issues on warrant writing, and this goes so well with vegan Chinese food. I talked about dealing with the live-born offspring, seizing the entire population. When you do a hoarding case, you're going to have 10% of the animals that are in pretty good shape. You're going to have 50% of the animals that are near death. And then there's going to be this weird 40% that are sort of compromised, but not really. They're going to be all over the spectrum. And most defense lawyers will argue that you should only be seizing the animals that are manifesting symptoms of neglect, and that the animals that aren't showing symptoms aren't victims of neglect, and therefore there's no crime. And that's horse hockey. And you can write around that issue if you know what you're doing on drafting search warrants. And if you ever get into a situation where you need language, call me. We've got it. The other issue regarding animal cruelty cases and warrant writing, or in general rather, is treating animals as evidence rather than as victims of the crime. And you've got animals that are seized as evidence, but if you leave them in cages while the case grinds its way through the criminal justice system for the next 12 to 18 months, that dog or that cat or that horse is going to go nuts from the confinement and likely get euthanized rather than adopted because the behavior is compromised. So many states, over 30 states, have express statutory remedies to address the ownership of the animals for animals that are seized for neglect by their owners. And pre-conviction forfeiture, bonding and cost of care remedies, and lien attachment and foreclosure, those are big aspects of the criminal justice system in terms of mitigating the suffering of animals in a cruelty case on the front end by getting them out of the system and into homes before the criminal case is resolved. And for some of you that are worried about the presumption of innocence and whether or not pre-conviction forfeiture violates the constitutional presumption of innocence, there's a Supreme Court case from '79 that deals with that issue in express terms in the context of pretrial conditions of confinement. And if you want to read Bell versus Wolfish, there's the site.
If I could jump in for a second about that. We don't have in New York the pre-conviction forfeiture, but we do our very best to get the animals surrendered. So when the officers go and execute a search warrant and the ASPCA is there and they're on site pursuant to the search warrant as well, we always get the defendants to surrender the animals. Not always. I'm going to say 95% of the cases. So there's a voluntary surrender. So at that point, then the ASPCA can bring the animals back to health and adopt them out over time as they are better, getting better all the time. If they do not surrender, there's another statutory mechanism for the ASPCA to, once a criminal action is started, they can go into the same criminal court and start a proceeding to post security or a bond. So if the defendant does not post the security and bond for the care of all the animals, which without medical care amounts to about $40 a day just for room and board, if they can't post it, that's when the forfeiture will occur.
The other issue with animal cruelty cases, and I'm almost done, Niki's going to take over, is just the unwilling prosecutor. And I'm not going to show you this video because of time constraints, but this is I'll just tell you about it. This guy, Ron Turner, is a jerk. And if you want to hang around after, I'll show you the video. But what this guy did to this yellow lab is amazingly cruel, but surprising in the fact that this dog survived, and not only survived, but didn't really have any major injuries. Some bruising, some stiffness, but this dog didn't have any broken bones. Basically, this guy blew his top, was picking this dog up and body slamming it on the ground, picked up a wooden doghouse and smashed it over. The dog's just laying there calmly taking this abuse from this asshole and wasn't injured. God bless this woman, because the next door neighbor videotaped the entire thing through the shade, even pleading with her husband to intervene, and he not so politely declined her invitation. This is in Kentucky. We got a hold of the case, and we got a hold of the prosecutor in this case, who had charged it as a misdemeanor cruelty and had the option of charging it as a torture case, which, even though it wasn't at a felony level at that time in Kentucky, it still carried more collateral consequences and more consequences potentially at sentencing. And when we got a hold of the prosecutor basically told me, conflict of interest, anybody? I know this guy. He's a good old boy. We don't need to go that hard on him. Besides, he's got a DUI pending, so I'm not going to charge him for the torture, on the torture theory. Very frustrating outcome. You know, I speak the inside language. I'm an elected DA, and I'm telling this guy all the reasons why he needs to go balls to the wall on this guy and just nail him to the cross, and he won't do it. So it's frustrating. But these guys are aging out of the system. And the good news in Kentucky is, aside from the fact that that dog, Romeo, survived, is thriving, was adopted into a loving home, the good citizens of Kentucky that care about animals, and there aren't that many, they actually got a law passed in 2008, 2009 called Romeo's Law, which is the name of this dog, and actually got felony level status for this type of case if there's actual serious physical injury or death or a second or subsequent conviction. So they made some progress. It wouldn't have necessarily fixed this case, but it definitely helps for subsequent offenders and for more serious cases involving injury. A couple more quick points regarding fitness, and you know what, I'm going to skip this in the sake of time. The victim issue I mentioned earlier, another area regarding advancing the rights of animals or the interests of animal in the criminal justice system. You got the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, emergency aid, exigent circumstances, all that stuff. You also have victims' rights theories that can apply. And in Oregon, we had some pretty good success in Nix and in Hess, where at least in the context of sentencing merger, which is where the court will compress convictions into one punishment if they arise from the same criminal episode, but you violate the statute multiple times. Think hoarding. You got 100 cases. You got 100 dogs in a hoarding case. You charge 8. You get a conviction on 8. And they were all part of the same criminal episode. The court will merge and sentence the guy for one offense. We had that issue come up in Oregon, and we had the trial court rule against the state. Took it up to the Court of Appeals and the Oregon Supreme Court. Both the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court said, no, each individual animal is a victim in that context. Therefore, no merger or compression of those crimes. Separately punishable offenses. And that's a big deal because that's the first toehold in the notion that animals qualify as victims and they get statutory and in some cases constitutional rights down the road. Long way to go on this, but it's a toehold. I'm done. Nikki, you're up. Oh, wait. Take it. You got to take in the joke, right? Fitness. Plenty. All right.
I don't know where I can hook this. Is that OK? Can you all hear me? OK. So I love this cat. This is me. I've been a prosecutor for a long time, 26 years. I also was in private practice, so I'm a lot older than even that 26 years. Currently, I am chief of the Animal Cruelty Prosecutions Unit in the Queens County DA. And I'm going to tell you the story of how I got to be there, because previous to that, I had been doing appeals as a deputy chief in appeals for many, many years, 17 years. And I learned a lot of stuff along the way. I worked on a lot of cases, from shoplifting to death penalty cases. But I've always loved animals, and I was not smart enough to be a vet, I will tell you that. But more importantly, the only thing I really knew about animals was I'm coming back as one of my own because they are all spoiled. This is my boss, Richard A. Brown. He's the district attorney of Queens County, and he's been in office for 26 years. Which is the longest tenured DA in the history of Queens County. And he's been around a long time for the very reason that he has vision and he always is into doing initiatives. And we do a lot of different initiatives in our office. And I ended up proposing to him the initiative of the Animal Cruelty Prosecutions Unit. Let's see if I can get the dog in here. OK, so this is the dog Levy in the case that I talked about that was in the Court of Appeals. And this is shows you how we document some of these cases. The dog had been tied to a fence on a 4-foot line for weeks and weeks and weeks with no food, no shelter, and no water. In a county or in a city where a lot of people just will step over dead bodies and crime, I was pretty shocked to learn, and this is one of the things I learned from this case, at how offended people were that people kept calling the police to try to do something about it. They felt bad for this dog. So ultimately, the dog is rescued, the defendant is charged, and he's charged with the misdemeanor cruelty for failing to provide sustenance to this dog. Ultimately, I'm going to show you the dog. He is, after a few weeks of just feeding, there was nothing wrong with him. The defendant said, I couldn't afford to feed him, so he never claimed that the dog somehow was sick or there was some other underlying physical problem that made the dog so skinny. It was a little difficult to tell, and this was one of the defenses, apart from the fact that it was justification because he didn't have any money, which really turns out to be is not justification at all. Justification in the legal sense is something quite different. It's not because you don't have money to feed the dog. It's because in a serious situation where there's a life-threatening situation to yourself or to others, that's what legal justification is for a crime, not I don't have money to feed my dog. So ultimately, this dog is just back to health, given food for 3 weeks, just 3 weeks. He's a healthy weight, and he's adopted. So it's a really happy ending. And it's also a really happy ending for me because I win the case in the Court of Appeals. And that is where the idea begins to germinate that we need to take these cases. As I said before, I'd never seen one of these cases. And one of the reasons is we were taking the cases. It wasn't like we weren't doing the cases, but we were doing them sort of randomly. If there was a police officer who saw something and he would make an arrest, if it was maybe somebody who didn't throw out the body or didn't do something that was somewhat foolish, we would be able to, they would make an arrest and they take the case. I was not seeing them in appeals because they were taking pleas on these cases to basically violations that had nothing to do with animal law and had nothing to do with crime. So we could only appeal on the misdemeanor or the felony situation. And so we had randomly taken them. It was assigned to one criminal court assistant who was the misdemeanor assistant. That assistant would have hundreds of cases literally. And from year to year, as that person moved through the office, a new assistant would come. So there was absolutely no consistency. There was no consistency among what the police were doing. And what I learned during the course of this is that there's a major law enforcement shift going on at the same time I am doing the case. In 2014, the NYPD replaces the ASPCA as the law enforcement agency to make arrests in these cases. And that is major. And I'll talk a little bit more about how they're doing it and what they're doing, but they've been tremendously successful in doing it. Similarly, now we're going to see law enforcement take a really hard look at these cases. In 2015, the FBI classes animal cruelty crimes, reclassifies animal cruelty crimes as top-tier crimes. Group A offenses, crimes against society. What are the crimes against society? Homicide, assaults, arsons, burglaries, robberies. So now these crimes are beginning to be tracked. So the police departments report into the FBI for reporting purposes. And what do? What they do is they keep track of the crime so they can really perceive what's going on, what are these kinds of incidents, and how are we going to deal with this stuff. So in 2014, this ACES squad, it is the Animal Cruelty Investigations Squad. And this squad is a huge, they're so successful. They're an elite squad. The initial model was for sort of volunteer police officers who are not as experienced and who are animal lovers. That model is almost immediately scrapped by the commissioner. And what he does is says, I need to get a group of men and women who are experienced detectives. And they go about hand-picking very experienced homicide, cold case, ones who have had multiple years of experience and who had had success and who also liked animals. But it was more important to be a great investigator than it was to be an animal lover, just like it's more important as a prosecutor for me to be a good prosecutor and not an animal lover. You must have a healthy distance, certainly, from the crimes that you're doing. Now, these officers are specially trained, and they are partnering with the ASPCA. So now the ASPCA relinquishes the law enforcement role, and they take over the forensics, which is really important. And they have a fantastic animal hospital in Manhattan, and all of the animals are transported that are subject to these arrest procedures, and they're transported to the animal hospital where necropsies are performed, exams are performed, cause of injury, cause of death, and I have seen lots and lots and lots of autopsy reports. They do a better job on the necropsy, more promptly, more well documented than I've ever seen on any autopsy. And the NYPD detective detectives who are involved in this will say the same. I only wish I had as good an autopsy when I was working homicide. So that partnership is a really great partnership. And so this way you've got it's divided between the NYPD and the ASPCA. The big thing is it's mandatory training for every officer in New York City. There is a huge commitment. So in the police academy, they do a full-day training. I have attended their full-day training. It is tremendous. It is detailed. It is professional. And they do it department-wide. So academy, and if you haven't gone through the academy with the training, you have to take the training. They've trained about 6,000 officers so far, and they continue to have now quarterly. They were doing it monthly, and it's everyone from patrol to brass. So now when police officers are going out into the street and they see the dead dog, they're not tossing the dog. Now they know what to do with the dog. They know that they need to get search warrants. They know that they need to consult with the DA. So in fact, rather than the police officers doing search warrants in our county, they come to me to do all the search warrants. So I'm going to draft the warrant. I'm going to just say, is there probable cause? You don't have probable cause yet. Go out, get me an X, Y, and Z, and then we'll have probable cause. And they know not to jump the gun. They know to enhance the cases this way by getting the right probable cause, by getting the search warrants done correctly, by doing the returns on the warrants. And then once I have the return on the warrant, it's very easy for me to draft a felony complaint because I've got all my probable cause. I've got my whole narrative of what they saw, what they heard, what was done, and who did it. So that's been a great thing. Ultimately, and now it's starting to roll out, what they are doing is having a liaison, an animal liaison, in every precinct in New York City. And that's starting to just come out little at a time. Now, that also is, they're applying for it in their precinct. It is a very now plum position in the precinct, whereas before they might have laughed at the animal guy or the animal gal officer. That's not happening anymore. It's actually a plum position, and they get some benefits for it. They are also using the 911 system, the 311 system, and Crime Stoppers, which I'm going to show you this is one of their posters, and it's similar to the rewards. The rewards are very, very helpful. People respond to that, and it has to be sort of the right amount of award for it to be okay. If it's too little, no one will respond. If it's too much, sometimes you get the defendant to respond. So it's very effective. It's got to be in about that $2,500 range. So yeah, that's quite something that I've learned. So here's where the animal cruelty, it's the Group A crime. I'm going to just skip through that. But what it does is actually recognize animal abuse as a red flag for future violence. So after I have done Basile, I've learned a couple of things. Law enforcement is shifting. And I've also learned this business about the link, that there is a link between violence to animals and violence to humans. And all I start to think is, this is our entire criminal element. If you have people who are committing crimes against animals, they are going to commit violent crimes against people as well. This guy, we all remember. Maybe if someone had noticed, like his mother or a teacher, that he was skinning animals as early as 8 years old and keeping the bones, we might not have gone down that bad road. So maybe we're going to get some prevention. Maybe we won't. But at that point, if there's intervention and you're going to identify these people as having issues, maybe you can get them help so that they're not committing future crimes, or those future crimes are limited. This is Jason Bond. This case was prosecuted in my office. In the DV, in the domestic violence arena, it is a huge problem where people are at risk, animals are at risk, and where animals are at risk, people are also at risk. And Jason Bond was a lawyer who was abusing his girlfriend, and she almost got help and had a safe haven, but then got worried because he threatened to kill the dog. He's going to go home and find the dog dead. So she goes home, and what happens is she gets dead instead, because he is very upset with her because she's tried to leave him. And it's a very chilling case, because what he does is he's accusing her of making phone calls and cheating on him. And he accidentally hits, somebody's phone number, and his murdering of her is recorded in chilling detail as she begs for her life. And why? For the dog, all for the dog, because he had threatened the dog, and those threats were real. The dog survives. Unfortunately, she does not. And then, of course, you have Michael Vick with the dog fighting, and this brought to light what is organized abuse of animals. So not only do you have organized abuse among people like this, but what you have is organized abuse in gangs, and it's a big issue in gangs. So now we've got the generally violent people, the DV people, and the gang people, and this is, again, our entire criminal element. And I just keep thinking, we really need to identify these people. We need to centralize. We need to be consistent in how we treat them. The final thing that I learn is that people are extremely upset over abuse of animals. And it is going viral all across the country, goes back and forth. Andre Robinson was a guy in Brooklyn. So this case also was going on at the same time that I was studying all of this and learning about this. He lures, it's a 12-second video that he ends up posting. He lures a cat over to him with some treats, and he kicks the cat 20 feet in the air and does a little dance, and he and his friends start laughing. I tell you, within minutes, he is identified. He posts that. He's identified by people in his neighborhood. He lives in the projects. And the projects are a bunch of poor people. They have a lot of crime there. They're so offended by this that they report him, and they're very upset. Ultimately, the case is prosecuted. He does not understand what he's done wrong. He says, people in my project, people in my neighborhood do much worse stuff. Why are you coming after me? He was shunned after this case, and no one speaks to him. It also generated 2 New York Times articles in which Laura Dunn of AlDF is even quoted in it. So it takes off in a way that is high media coverage, high social media coverage, and there you have it. So I go to my DA, and I propose to him that we do a unit, and that I be the head of it, of course. My DA, again, it has vision. He says, that's a great idea. This is in September, end of August, September. I had one Basile in July, so this is about a month later. And he immediately has his press person draft a press release and a transfer memo, and he says, do it. Well, some people in my office who are in high places thought that that was a dumb idea, and they didn't like the idea. So you have this old guard saying, that's stupid. We don't need to really put resources into this. We're already doing those cases. And my DA says, no, let's do it. Well, we need to replace her. What are we going to do with her? She's in a high position where she is. And ultimately, he says, find someone to replace her, and I'm doing it. So effective January of this year, I finally get my unit, though I had been now working with the police officers during that 4-month period, all of the ACES squad people. They're still coming for, consulting about search warrants and the like. And now what it is, we work closely with them to investigate and enhance these cases. And we've got the ASPCA forensics, which is really, really helpful to us. And the first case that we do, which I promised my DA, this is going to be high press, is this case, People versus Estevez. This is Brewster the Boxer. I'll show you another couple of pictures of Brewster the Boxer. The defendant in this case goes into a city shelter carrying this dog in a sweater, because you can see he's all bones. And he said, I found this dog in a park, and I want to turn him over to you. He gives the wrong address, and then because he keeps talking, because that's what defendants do, because they can't stop. So he keeps talking, and he says, well, I didn't really find him in the park. A friend of mine who has 2 kids had this dog, and she gave him to me, so I'm bringing it in for her. The ACES guys, again, this might have just gone unnoticed. They may not have done anything, and the dog might have just gone to the shelter, but the ACES detectives say, we need to go take a look at that. And they go and they find this defendant who gives an address that was a couple of doors down. And what they're asking is, where's the woman with the 2 kids? Because if the dog looks like this, what do the kids look like? How are the children living? So they're doing a very good job with it. Well, they talk to him, and he says, well, really, it was my dog. So they bring him to me, where we do a videotape statement, and he confesses it was my dog, and I don't know what happened, but I was afraid he was going to die in my room, so I brought him into the shelter. Okay, and we did a search warrant. We searched his apartment and got everything dog-related out. And the happy ending is, to that story is, here's what the dog looks like some weeks later. That's him with my boss. And on the very same day, he gets released from the ASPCA hospital at what is called healthy weight. The defendant in this case pleads guilty. Had never been arrested before. It's a first arrest. He's 26 years old. And he pleads guilty to the felony for aggravated cruelty. And that, at this point, is unheard of. The defense attorney urged him very much so, to take the plea because she herself was getting hate mail. It was all over the press. It was all over the news about, you know, what creep does this to his dog. And so he does take a felony plea. He has an animal ban. He got a conditional discharge, no jail time, but he's also required to register for the Animal Abuse Registry in New York City, which I'm going to talk about too. This is what I like to call Brewster in love. This is Brewster last week. He's been adopted by a family who loves him. I think feeds him steaks every night. He must have a king-size bed. It's a wonderful thing. So in the 6 weeks that I have been involved in this as the unit chief of our very new unit, I've gotten 4 new felony cases, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. We've initiated with the NYPD ASIS squad several long-term investigations, and we've had this outpouring of community support. I go to the ladies' room, and I come back, and my voicemail is full. My emails are full. There is news. We've gotten a lot of press about it. We've gotten requests to do documentaries about it. People who are doing theses for their senior projects are asking to come and interview us. So those 4 new felony cases bring up a bunch of stuff. Some of these issues, the defense exams, Animal Abuse Registry, shelter issues, mental health issues. The first case that I get is a case where during a domestic violence dispute, the defendant grabs his girlfriend's dog, smashes the dog to the floor, and kills the dog. So the first issue that I have in that case is the woman wants the dog back for cremation and to bury the dog. And now I have to notify the defense about it. And how do I do that? Do I give him the opportunity to do another exam? How much time do I have to give him for that? All of these are really unsettled issues, in part because the dog is evidence. And so as prosecutors, we have to disclose evidence. Maybe there's some Brady material in the dog, maybe there isn't. But the other thing that happens is that I just decide as a matter of practicality that I'm going to, in every case, immediately upon arraignment, give notice to the defense, give them 20 days to get an expert to come in, or they're done. And so far, this defense attorney says, I'm not going to get an expert. Make sure you preserve all of the autopsy photos, which of course, I do. The second case that I get is one of these animal liaison cases. So this is a brand new officer just out of the academy. And like the Romeo case, the defendant is seen kicking, punching, dragging the dog, slamming the dog down, and people are offended, similar to the Andre Robinson cases. There are some not so nice people, but they're calling 311, and now they're very upset by this. They go into the police station, and they report it, and this he's a young officer, this officer does a great job. He goes out, and he gets video surveillance from inside the building. He has now footage footage of this defendant slamming, kicking, dragging the dog by his collar, choking it up 3 flights of stairs. The dog is yelping. The dog is crying. He comes to us. We give him a search warrant. We get a search warrant done. We go to get the dog, and this also has a happy ending. The dog is actually like this, crouched under a milk crate with cases of soda on top of them, so he can't even move. So we get there. The dog jumps out of the milk crate. And he's wagging his tail. He's totally happy. And as it turns out, the same as Romeo, there aren't many injuries to the dog, and the dog's been adopted out. We've got this animal abuse registry in New York. It's a New York City registry. Would I say, will it be better to have a statewide registry? Yes, and I think there's a proposal in Massachusetts, maybe one in Tennessee that's already statewide. It's on the books. National registry would be even better, because what happens is, what do these people do? Move from county to county, place to place. So they have, it's administered by the Department of Health, so it is not a penal issue, although some of the judges are calling it an ex post facto issue, which it is not, because it's not penal. There's an animal ban, and the failure to register is actually a misdemeanor. So we can go out and get all of these people who are not registering. The problem is a lot of people don't know about it. So now what I'm doing in all of my cases, right out of the gate, I say with my plea offers, he's going to be required to register. He's going to waive appeal, because well, we waive appeal anyway, but you don't have to register until your appeals are concluded, which brings up a whole host of problems. Who's going to tell us when the appeals are concluded? Who's going to tell the defendant when the appeals are concluded, so that he has to go in, or she has to go and register? And so I'm getting them to have it as a condition of the plea that they register, and as part of their waiver of appeal, and that seems to be helping a little bit in getting these defendants to register. I have another case, and again, it's a search warrant issue, and not a search warrant, it's a disposal of the body, where this is my third felony. The defendant is seen about 3 o'clock in the morning by police officers who otherwise might not have thought about it, got a box and a shovel, and what is he doing? He's going to bury his dead dog, who he's starved to death. And he says, oh, by the way, I have another dog up in my apartment who's on the verge of death. It couldn't walk. It was skin and bones, just like you saw Brewster. And so they are able to, rather than dispose of the body, rather than ignore it, they bring the dog to the ASPCA, and the second dog now is recovering fully. So that's a great case. Then we have a hoarding case that we haven't charged yet, 70 animals recovered. Those bring up mental health issues, because obviously people who hoard, animals and have them in, feces and urine, and in a deplorable condition with flies buzzing all around, they're not of sound mind. But that case has some other proof problems, because we have the mother, an elderly mother, is about 80 years old, and about a 50-year-old daughter. Whose animals are these? They won't surrender the animals, so that's a real problem for us. Some of the animals are in better shape than other animals, so how are we going to charge that case, which is extremely difficult. So we have that going on. Then we've got a cockfighting and a dog fighting investigation that started. I can't really tell you too much about it, except for we have an issue now where we've seized a bunch of roosters, and the ASPCA cannot manage the roosters. They can't house them. They potentially have avian flu or other diseases. They're potentially a health hazard. So we're up in the air about what to do. We have in our search warrant language that says, and again, I'm drafting all of these, the language says not only can the ASPCA be present for the search, but the ASPCA can also take custody of the animals and conduct examinations. Doesn't say anything about euthanizing animals. And when you deliver deliver into the court your return, you have to say what happens. You have to have the evidence, because they're evidence, available for delivery into the court. Well, if the animals are euthanized, they're not going to be deliverable into the court, even though they're being held by the ASPCA. If you have these animals that are evidence, and there's no arrest yet, there's no defense attorney who I can get to waive any of these requirements, what are we going to do with this animal? With all of these animals there, because there are about 70 of them. And that's becoming a real problem for us. So unless the court orders, and that's what the search warrant says, some other thing to happen with this evidence. So, the question now is, does the ASPCA have to go into the court and petition the court for permission to do something else with the animals? Because all we said was you could be present on the scene and you can take them. Doesn't say anything about killing them. So that's a big issue. So we have shelter and extreme weather. This has come up because we've had a historic blizzard as well as sub-zero temperature. There's been some conflict in the police protocol about what do you do in those cases. New York has not only its animal cruelty statute, but after that statute are a bunch of violations. One of those violations has to do with shelter, providing proper shelter for dogs. Obviously, a Maltese dog and a Husky dog require different kinds of shelters, and there are some dogs who do live outside as long as they have appropriate housing and shelter. If you don't, you get a ticket for it. It's a violation. Well, in these extreme cases, and it came out of Brooklyn, a neighbor was videotaping a dog in the blizzard crying and shivering. They call the police go there, and they say, bring that dog inside, and the woman brings the dog inside, but then lets the dog back outside when everything, when the police leave. So at that point, the police say, we can't arrest, we can only give a ticket in that circumstance, and we're having this ongoing dispute about what can you do. I say it's cruelty. Now I'm in touch with NYPD legal to say, your protocols are wrong. That's a separate thing. Shelter is one thing. You have to have shelter, and if you don't have appropriate shelter, that's a violation, and a ticket can be given for that. But it is cruel to leave the animal. What are we going to do? Wait till the animal is frozen solid in the snow before we seize the animal and arrest the defendant? I don't think so. I think that's a bad idea. So mental health issues, as I said, with the hoarding issues, we have so many problems. Figuring out how do you do it. We have diversion courts. We have a mental health court. We have a lot of alternative sentencing options, and we do need to decide what to do about that. The other case that I have is a felony case, is a case where the defendant, his brother is upstairs, he hears yelping, and he hears a big smashing. He goes downstairs, he sees the dog's head has been smashed in, and it's probably a glass vase that it's been smashed in with, because that's what the scene pictures look like. But the defendant himself has attempted harikari. He's got a Japanese sword, and he's actually run it through himself. So, what do we do? What do we do in that case? That defendant is now in a psych ward, also under police guard, because he has been charged. But again, there's obviously some mental health issues involved in that case, and we'll have to make some decisions about what we're going to do to help him. So I say thanks for listening, and that's the end. Unless you have questions. Does anybody have questions?
Please, who asked you to use the handheld mic, because we're recording. So if someone wants to run the mic, question right here. And unplug that, and you and Scott can trade off.
Okay. If I can get it off.
Thank you. I have a quick question for each one of you. On the first presentation, I was interested when the DA said that he's charged with DUI or whatever, and he didn't want to do it. Does jurisprudence has any tools at all to force him?
It's a really good question. What do you do when you have a prosecutor who will not charge a case, but the community sentiment is the prosecutor should be exercising their discretion in a manner that's different than what they're doing? The answer to that is, as a general rule, no. It's a discretionary call on the part of an independently elected executive branch official, and they're politically accountable for that decision, but they're not subject to a lawsuit or any sort of bar beef if they choose to just say, you know what, I'm not going to do dog cases ever. I don't have the resources for it. I'm going to allocate my resources to something else. So the amount of discretion a prosecutor has is very broad. There are some statutes, a very few number of states have some limited statutory ability to question the DA's authority. Wisconsin has that. Although it's never been really fully litigated, I think that's got a separation of powers vulnerability that'll get tested at some point down the road. So it's a good question, but as a general rule, no.
So just to clarify, there is no statutory limitations on a DA part to be able to be pressed to prosecute it?
Again, in Wisconsin, there's that one remedy.
In Massachusetts.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't done the research in Massachusetts. Sorry. In Oregon, there's a specific statute that says DAs can't plead drunk drives down to reckless drivings, and you'll see those sorts of weird little procedural things scattered around the codes around the country. But again, you got a separation of powers issue on those on whether or not those are actually enforced.
And the second question I have for you is when somebody chooses to give up their child and brings it to the fire station or police station, which is a common practice, it's better than the child to be thrown in a garbage can. When in the first example that you were given, the guy came to the police station, was willing to give up the dog, in some ways you can view it as a positive step. He was trying to do something about it instead of...
That's true. You could view it as...
You really want to discourage it?
Right. No, I don't want to discourage it, and we would never want to discourage it. But what we'd like to do is encourage it to happen at some point before the animal. If you can't feed the animal or you're not willing to take care of the animal, what you should be doing is giving up the animal before it is on its last leg. That dog probably had almost no time left. It could no longer walk. There's a scale of emaciation, and it goes from 1 to 10, and this dog was on a 1. 0 is dead. And so we would want to encourage these people to do something different. That's true. It was a final act of mercy, but the way that he explained it was, I didn't want him to die in my room. So he didn't really want to be held accountable for the dog being dead in his room.
I had exactly that case as DA where parents of a, I had exactly that case where parents of a child brought the child to the fire station and dropped the child off without any injuries or any maltreatment. I did not charge that case because we wanted to reward that behavior. And the legislature ultimately enacted a statutory immunity for parents who do that. In Niki's case, had the guy not waited till the dog was near death, I think the equities mitigate in favor of not charging that case. But when the dog got that far down the line, that guy needs to be held accountable, at least in my humble opinion.
And the other thing about it was he was not accepting any. He had some consciousness of guilt in it by saying, "It's not my dog. I found it as a stray." So he was aware that he had done this damage to the dog. I mean, the dog is in his apartment with no access to food or water unless he gives it to him.
Hi, my name is Imani. Thank you very much for coming today. I care very strongly about animal rights issues, and I was curious if people of color are most responsible for the violent crimes against animals.
I would say not. I'm seeing just a range of all kinds of people doing it because, violence goes across the board, and that's not what I'm seeing, at least in my experience so far.
Well, the only reason why I ask is because in this presentation, the most violent pictures and the most violent descriptions were linked to people of color.
Which ones?
So you started off with a mugshot of 2 people of color.
Then that was in the Richardson case?
Yep, and we talked about
how videos?
Yep, we were talking about the crush videos. Later on, we mentioned someone else who was not of color, but people were eating. Then after, we saw the picture of Michael Vick and the dog, but when we talked about the people who are not of color, there was just pleasant pictures of them, and the descriptions were not as violent.
I'm going to say for myself, I don't have any defendants of color right now, so I'm not... I'm not seeing that as a trend or not a trend.
Well, the reason why I bring it up is maybe those pictures should also be in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't really give you pictures of the defendants that I currently have because you're not allowed to speak, about the names, or I could just tell you the facts of the case. I can't tell you exactly about this, so I wouldn't be able to give you pictures of those defendants. Only the ones where the cases have been concluded. So maybe at some later point, we would be able to include all of those pictures, if that's a concern.
I'd toss in, you make a valid point, but I would also submit that with respect to the crush video case, there's only one case that's been prosecuted since the amendment of the statute, and it involves those two defendants. So there's, as it relates to that crime or that statute, that's the only case in the federal system so far. So, but you make a valid point.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming today. I'm not a law student. I am active in animal welfare, and in fact, I just completed a campaign, a PSA campaign for the city of New York to encourage adoption from the city's municipal shelters. So my question is directed to Nikki. The work you're doing is fantastic.
Thank you.
More of it is needed. I'm wondering if you're getting to, and I realize that your unit is new, but the majority of animals that are stray and brought to shelters are turned into the city's municipal shelters, which they're working on their save rate at this point. They've not had a great reputation for such a large.
But it is improving.
It is improving. We'd like to see it go higher. 30,000, over 30,000 animals are turned into the shelter every year. Of those, over 18,000 are stray. And as you mentioned from your experience, many of these are not simply animals that wander off from their property. They are either deliberately abandoned, which I believe is a misdemeanor.
Also a misdemeanor, yes, it is.
In New York, or owners bring them in claiming to have found them, and they're often brought in deplorable condition, much like Brewster was. Are you working to forge alliances with the city's municipal shelters as well to prosecute some of these cases? It must be overwhelming to think about doing that.
That's how Brewster came into our hands, and the NYPD is doing that. And in fact, part of their training involves ACC talking about how to manage the cases and what they do and what their responsibilities are. So the NYPD has a relationship with ACC as well as the ASPCA, and everyone I think is working towards doing a better job with all of those cases. I mean, the reason that Brewster got highlighted for them was because of the story that he told. If he didn't move on to the stray story probably would have been left alone, but when he said it, there was a woman with 2 kids that he got the dog from, that's when everybody's antenna went up, as well they should have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks very much for this talk. I was struck you didn't give an explanation for why there was a kind of sea change, or a number of dramatic things happened to benefit animals around 2014, 2015. I think the establishment of, what is it called, the ASIS unit or protocol.
ASIS unit, yes.
The reclassification on the part of the FBI of animal cruelty as a top-tier crime. So what's the background there? How did this happen? Who instigated it? Who made it move? And how long did it take?
It took. I'm sure it took many years. But the background was the many studies that were being done about the link between animal violence and human violence, and there were more and more studies that were being published, and it was publicized more. And in fact, in enacting all of the felony statutes in the many states, all 50 states now have felony animal cruelty statutes. That was the factor that was being pointed to as a significant change. And maybe before that, there weren't such studies, or there weren't as many studies, and the proof was not as positive. And so it became, I think, unmanageable also for the ASPCA to continue to do both the forensic work as well as the law enforcement work. And that's how that change came about. But I think it has really to do with the link.
The link with violence against
between
humans.
violence and
so
animals.
Just a very quick question. How would you rate the New York City approach to abuses of animals nationally? Like, would you say that as
You mean for the registry?
in the top 10? No, how would you rate it in terms of protection granted to animals within the city?
Comparatively?
Compared to other cities or?
Well, now I think we're probably the best model that there is in the country, given the level of commitment and the resources that are being put behind the NYPD in these kinds of cases. In terms of animal rankings for laws generally, AlDF does their national rankings about how the laws work, but I think our model in New York City is being viewed around the country and is being looked at to see, is this what we should all be doing? And I certainly hope that it is, because it has been effective. There's been a dramatic increase in the number of 164% increase over 1 year period in arrests, and they investigated over 700, I think, 50 cases in a year, which was a huge increase also over the prior year. That answers your question.